Welcome to English 1120, Introduction to Grammar at Southern Utah University. In this video, we are going to discuss dependent clauses, and we'll compare the subordinating clauses that we've talked about in the past with these relative clauses. And we'll talk about how relative clauses can use relative pronouns, and we'll look at example sentences, and then we'll also talk about how relative clauses can use relative adverbs, and we'll look at an example of that. So previously, we've already talked about dependent clauses. Dependent clauses are parts of sentences that can't exist on their own, even though they have both a subject and a predicate. So we looked at them in the context of subordinating clauses, where they're functioning adverbially. And so here's an example. My cat made a mess while I napped. So we have two sentences that are in here. My cat made a mess and I napped is another one. But when we add that subordinating conjunction on here, while, that second sentence becomes a dependent clause and it requires a connection to the other sentence. When we look at the diagram for this complex sentence, we can see that coordinating or subordinating conjunction is coming off of the verb there. And it's connecting the sentence to the verb. It's different when we deal with a relative clause. So relative clauses do not function adverbially, they function adjectivally, which means they're describing one of the noun phrases in the independent sentence. So we have the cat who made a mess is napping. Who made a mess is describing the cat. It's not describing how or when the napping is happening. It's a description of the cat. So in this sense, we say it's functioning adjectively, and that's what relative clauses do. So let's look at some examples of sentences that use relative pronouns. The most common relative pronouns are listed here. We have ones that we tend to use with animate objects, mostly with people. We may also use them with animals or other things that we think of as being alive. So who we use as the subject, whom we use for the object, and whose we use when the relative is about a possessive determiner. Now be aware that the who-whom distinction is disappearing in English. Lots of people just use who in both cases, and it's considered acceptable to do that. You may have those who are really strict and want to hold to tradition and insist that whom be used, but you'll find that many people no longer use that in current fluent English. With more inanimate objects, we tend to use that as both the subject and object. That tends to be used more with restrictive or defining clauses. So we're providing a piece of information, an adjectival statement about the noun that is necessary to identify that noun. It helps us understand which noun we're talking about. Which, on the other hand, again, can also be used for the subject and object, but it tends to be used more in unrestricted contexts. So we're not providing a piece of information that is necessary to identify the noun phrase, but it just provides more information about the noun phrase. And then we also use the who sometimes with inanimate objects when we need a possessive determiner. So this list of relative pronouns is helpful in some ways because it helps us show how English is changing. Things that used to be very strict, the who-whom distinction is disappearing, and the that-which distinction used to be very strict, and now we often find it is not as distinct as it used to be. So let's look when a relative pronoun takes the place of the subject. Here are two sentences. The cat is napping, and the cat made a mess. We have both sentences are making reference to this cat. Because we have a common element between the two, we can now replace one of them with the relative pronoun. So in this case, because we want to replace the cat, which is the subject of the second sentence, with the relative pronoun, we can use who, and we can do that. And we get the cat who made a mess is napping. So really it's the cat who made a mess is napping. But we can replace that second cat with the relative pronoun, and then we stick it into our sentence there. So when we look at the diagram here, we have two sentences. One of them is the cat is napping. The other one is the cat made a mess. But then we can connect them by replacing the second, the cat, with the who, and then connecting that who with the dotted line up to the cat. It's describing that cat. It's an adjective or an adjectival clause, which is giving us more information about the cat. So the cat who is napping, or the cat who made a mess, is napping. You could also flip it the other way and say the cat who was napping made a mess. In this case, either option would be acceptable. Now here's what happens when we replace the second instance of the repeated phrase with a possessive determiner. So our original sentence, the cat is napping. Our second sentence is the cat's mess is still there. Now the cat is the repeated part, but the cat is part of a possessive phrase. And so we can't just replace the cat with who. It has to become possessive, the cat's. And that's where we get whose from, which sounds like who in a possessive form. So now we replace that, the cat's, with whose, and we get the cat whose mess is still there is napping. And so we see a similar thing. Okay, we have in our diagrams, we have the original sentence, the cat is napping. We have our second sentence underneath, the cat's mess is still there. And so what we're going to do is the cat's will be replaced by whose. And then that's the connection that we'll see. And again, whose mess is still there, that relative clause again is describing the cat. And so that's where we draw the connection. This is an example of a sentence where the relative pronoun takes the place of the object. So here we have the cat made a mess. And then we say the mess is still there. Okay, so it's not the cat that's being duplicated here, it's the mess. And in the original or the first sentence, the repeated part, it takes the object slot in that sentence. So then we can replace it with something like that. Okay? The cat made a mess that is still there. Okay? And so that is coming in after the mess. So if you look at our diagram, the cat made a mess, and the second sentence is the mess is still there. This time we're replacing the mess with that. Okay? And it's going to come off of the mess part of the sentence, not the cat. So the cat made a mess that is still there. Sometimes the relative or the repeated phrase is something that's in a prepositional phrase of the original sentence. So let's take a look here. We have a sentence called, I stepped in the mess. So the mess is part of this prepositional phrase, in the mess. And then the cat made a mess. Okay, so we have mess in both of them. In one of them, it's the part of the prepositional phrase. And the second one, it takes an object slot. So if we were to diagram the two sentences separately, we get I stepped in the mess and the cat made a mess. But what we want to be able to do here is replace that second mess with that, okay? The cat made that. And so when we do that, we would get I stepped in the mess and the cat made that. But then we take that, we put it at the front, and then we put that whole clause right after the thing that it's describing, which is the mess. And we get I stepped in the mess that the cat made. And we can see that in our diagram here, okay? In that prepositional phrase of in the mess, the word mess is being connected by that, which is the relative pronoun that appears at the end of the phrase, the cat made that. So let's go over some steps to describe all the things that we saw. The first thing we need to do is look at our two sentences and identify the repeated word or phrase in both sentences. Then we need to replace one of those repeated word or phrase with an appropriate relative pronoun. Decide, do we need who, that, which, whose? Okay. And then after we replace that, then we move that relative pronoun to the beginning of the clause if it's not already there. If it was who, and it was the subject of that second sentence, then it's already at the beginning. But as we saw in that example, when it might be replacing the object of the sentence, then it may appear at the end and we've got to front it to that clause. Once it's fronted at the beginning of the clause, then we take that dependent relative clause and we put it right after the word or phrase that it's describing. Now, sometimes when we do this, it's possible to omit or delete the relative pronoun. So we have the sentence already that we looked at. I stepped in the mess that the cat made. Right? Our original sentence was I stepped in the mess, the cat made the mess. And we changed it to the cat made that, and we put it at the front, and then we put it right after the mess. I stepped in the mess that the cat made. But because there are certain types of sentences where we could then drop that relative pronoun, and we could just say, I stepped in the mess the cat made. And this is a grammatical sentence. So the problem is, it's not as clear that it is a relative clause because we've dropped the relative pronoun. So for clarity, you want to keep that relative clause. But for brevity, we may want to omit or delete that relative pronoun. So you need to be aware of your choices when you're doing this. Do you want to keep the relative pronoun to make it clearer for the readers or the listeners that this is a relative clause? Or do you want to admit it for the sake of brevity? We do both. I tend to favor keeping it, especially because I work with English language learners a lot, and I want them to clearly see the structure of the sentence and to identify that clause. But in fluent English, I'm sure I drop it all the time. Now, something we need to be aware of is that we can only omit that relative pronoun when it functions as the object in the relative clause. If it's another part of that relative clause, we can't drop it. Grammatically, it just doesn't fit for us. It doesn't make sense. So let's look at 4 example sentences. The cat made a mess that is still there. Okay, this would be the cat made a mess and the mess is still there. So in the second sentence, that is replacing the mess, which is the subject of that clause, which means we cannot delete that. We cannot say the cat made a mess is still there. It doesn't work. In the second one, the cat whose mess is still there is napping. This has 2 sentences. The cat is napping and the cat's mess is still there. The cat's is the determiner for mess. It's not the object of that relative clause. So again, it cannot be deleted. We can't say the cat mess is still there is napping. It's not grammatical. In the third example, we have the cat who made a mess is napping. So we have the cat is napping, and the second one is the cat made a mess. So who replaces the cat, which is the subject of the sentence? Again, we can't drop it. We can't say the cat made a mess is napping. In our fourth example, we have the cat is napping, and we have I scolded the cat. And then we replace the cat with that, okay? But that, or the cat, in the I scolded sentence is the object of that clause. So that when we combine it, we can delete or omit that relative. We could say the cat I scolded is napping. That's the only instance where we can drop it, when it becomes the relative pronoun is replacing the object in the relative clause. So we talked about relative pronouns, and they replace a noun phrase. We can also talk about how relative clauses are created through relative adverbs. Okay? Now, these relative adverbs still create clauses that function adjectively, which means they're still describing nouns. Okay? But instead of these relatives replacing noun phrases, they're replacing adjective phrases. We most often will see them in prepositional phrases. And so most often we're going to see where and when used as relative adverbs. Now, we've already talked about where and when before when they were interrogatives. We use them to initiate questions. But we use when and where also in English as relative adverbs. Let's take a look at an example. So we have a sentence here. This is the room. The cat made a mess in this room. Now we have this prepositional phrase, in this room, and it contains the repeated part between the 2 sentences. So we could replace that second part, in this room, with the relative adverb where. Where can replace in this room. So then we have to take our next step is we have to take that relative and we have to put it at the front of that second sentence. So we'd still have this is the room, but then our second sentence would become where the cat made a mess. Okay? And then we take that phrase, where the cat made a mess, and we put it immediately after the noun that it is describing, in which case it was already here at the end of the first sentence. So we just remove the period and it fits right in. This is the room where the cat made a mess. Let's look at how it appears in the diagram. Okay, so we have our first, on the left here, our first two sentences. This is the room, and the cat made a mess in this room. That in this room part is going to be replaced by where. So when we look at the second side of our chart here, and we see the combined sentences, we still have this is the room, but coming off of room, we need a description, okay, of the room. This whole second relative clause is all describing the room, and it's where the cat made a mess. Right, so we can see that the where there is part of a prepositional phrase in that relative clause. In the room, in this room is replaced by where. And then the where is connected to the room of the original sentence because that's what it's describing. This is the room where the cat made a mess. Right, so in this video, we've talked about relative clauses and explained how relative clauses are different from other kinds of dependent clauses we've talked about because those ones, the dependent clause was functioning adjectively. It was coming off of the verb. Instead, relative clauses are connected to nouns within the sentence because they're describing the nouns. And sometimes we have these relative clauses where we have a relative pronoun that has replaced a noun phrase. Sometimes also we have relative adverbs that are part of usually a prepositional phrase within the repeated sentence. And they describe maybe when or where something is happening. But again, they're connected to a noun phrase in the original sentence because that's what they're describing.